Sup guys? In the past few days, I've been thinking long and hard about my tier lists and whether or not they accurately represented the current landscape of what ships and compositions are being used these days. And I ended up making these changes to better reflect my current opinions. In this video, I'm going to provide context for each of the changes for the Vanguard tier list, and maybe some to the non-changes as well. The first thing that I think I should probably cover are the two new tiers. The S** tier contains ships that are only good at a single thing, and if that's the thing you're doing, they are stupidly powerful and it would be a detriment to not bring them. In their niches, they're competitive and maybe even straight up better than the S tier ships, hence S with an asterisk, but they're just too rarely used in general to be placed in the same tier as the S tier ships. The other tier is the AA tier. These are ships that, if you don't need anti-air at all, they would probably hover around B tier, but if you do, they're at the top of the line in that aspect, with a baseline of a B tier ship. While that might not sound super amazing, there are actually amazing ships in the B tier now. It's just that stronger stuff keeps on coming, so some of the previously S or A tier ships have started to slide down the ranks. I try to maintain a high standard for my tier lists, keeping enough ships to give everyone a lot of options to choose from, but not too many so that I can't be bothered to test the ships on the tier list head to head whenever a question comes up. Currently, if I can count properly, there are 45 ships on the Vanguard tier list, here fighting for a maximum of 12 spots in Operations Iron Fleets, 6 spots in Campaign, and just 3 in Meta Showdown, which I think is more than enough to cover all bases. If you want to know, for example, whether Prinz Heinrich is better than Takao with her augment, you can refer to many of the other tier lists that are out there to get somewhat of an idea, and I don't like to keep you hostage to my information as the only valid source anyway. Personally though, I would be skeptical of their accuracy, as I've seen many placements that make no sense at all, which is why I'm choosing to run a tight ship here instead of lying to you guys about things I actually have no clue about. Take that with a grain of salt though, because I'm even skeptical of my past self a lot of the times, but most of the times when I go back to make sure I was correct, I find myself to be so true and based. Just wow. Okay, let's actually talk about the tier list now, starting with the S tier. If you look at the overall order, a lot of things are still relatively the same, just with some ships moved into the new tiers and the cutoff of the tiers being shifted a bit. The first 6 ships weren't touched at all. There are going to be some people who think I'm overrating Trafalgar way too much, but I really don't think so. The only area she is lacking in is personal damage, which isn't abysmal, and that is no reason for her not to be in this spot, especially when the ship directly in front of her deals even less damage than her. It is just unfortunate timing that the current meta boss happens to be a destroyer, and as a result, she has to compete with 2 other insanely powerful evasion rate debuffers, making her look like an alternative to a couple of random ships to the uninformed. When a medium or heavy armor boss, a difficult one at that, shows up, Trafalgar will get her chance to truly shine with her more or less unconditional evasion rate debuff. The first change, which isn't much of a real change, is that I moved Mogador 1 spot ahead, now in front of Laffy 2. Like I said when I made this tier list, a difference in 1 spot means pretty much nothing, especially with these two where they have little overlap in use case. The reason I did this though is twofold. First, Laffy's 2 major niches, being a tank that can carry your anti-air and anti-submarine simultaneously, is now replaceable by many other ships. Not all the other ships can do all 3 as well as Laffy can, but many of them can do 2 things better than her and then 1 slightly worse, while bringing even more value in other ways. Z46, for example, is not as good of a tank as Laffy, but is still very tanky, while deep mogging her in all other areas, including damage contribution via her debuff, anti-submarine, consistency, and their anti-air capabilities are about equal. Eldritch doesn't have the anti-air that Laffy has, but she contributes way more to your Vanguard's survival, and also has much better anti-submarine warfare, and also provides a crucial slow for many boss and compositions that can't afford to bring a dedicated slower in the main fleet. All of this while barely dealing less damage than Laffy. Trafalgar isn't really a tank at all, but does everything else equally or better while bringing much more damage in solo boss fights. The second reason I switched the two around is that invulnerability has become a much more desirable trait due to the recent trend of boss fights dealing a ridiculous amount of damage that having high EHP simply isn't enough. Even though Mogador is neither the tankiest nor the strongest, her periodic invulnerability means that even if the enemy deals a skibadillion damage within 2 seconds, Mogador's HP loss will be capped at 5% of her HP, provided that she has just used her lunge attack, which ironically makes her one of the more reliable tanks in fights like Wichita and Kawakaze meta, while pumping out way more damage than a traditional tank like a large cruiser or Napoli would be able to. So, the combination of Laffy's roles being supplanted by 3 other ships, and my growing appreciation for invulnerability is why I made the decision to ultimately make the switch. That means absolutely nothing, as it's a single spot and they have different roles. With the 2 of them switched, though, now Laffy is next to San Diego retrofit with unique augment, which makes a lot of sense since San Diego has better anti-air, about the same amount of anti-submarine, because Laffy's not actually a standout in that area, just solidly good like many other destroyers, and then San Diego also deals a lot more damage while being a lot less tanky. I think that the tankiness from Laffy is more useful than San Diego's damage where you would use them, but that depends entirely on your fleet composition and what it's missing. And the reason San Diego isn't in the AA tier is because of her ability to function as the dedicated anti-submarine ship as well as just doing more damage in general. Moving on, we have the S** tier. Aurora's damage increase is just ridiculous when it's applicable, but putting Aurora, who's used once a year if lucky, in the same tier as Z52 for example, who is used in literally everything, just felt a little weird. So this tier was pretty much made so that I can separate them, while still letting people know that, yeah, Aurora is nuts. Chapayev is another case of Aurora, but even more extreme. Instead of being usable against destroyers and light cruisers like Aurora, Chapayev is limited to literally just destroyer enemies. She provides similar but slightly less damage than Aurora to the fleet, while being much easier to keep alive. And my most consistent results in the current destroyer meta fight feature Chapayev for that reason. Speaking of which, on the tier list maker, you can now access my Kawakaze meta tier list by importing the tier list like so, which I will try to keep up to date with the rotating fights. Okay, next we have Helena, who is kind of a cheat code for progressing players. She's a very easy way to increase the overall damage output of your solo boss fleet by more than pretty much any other Vanguard ship is capable of, at the cost of consistency. Veteran players who are able to one-shot everything in the game more or less consistently are unlikely to feature her in their setups, and if that's the type of content you exclusively consume, then you might have the impression that she has fallen off and is irrelevant in 2025, but don't get it twisted. Even if you're not a complete noob, let's say you have a pretty developed account but your damage in meta fights caps out around 90% consistently without Helena, adding Helena to your fleet will allow you to one-shot the boss occasionally, and if you low roll, you would still have to do 2 attempts, which you would have had to do without her anyway. So just don't make the mistake of sleeping on her unless you have over 42,000 fleet tech, in which case you can cross her off your mind. Also, I don't recommend using her in campaign at all, even in the boss fleet. That's an entirely different topic though, so I'm going to move on. Next, moving into the A tier, we have Kazagumo. It's pretty rare for a boss fleet to run full carriers now, and every carrier you don't run is damage loss for Kazagumo, so she slipped to the A tier. If you run 2 carriers, she's still competitive with some of the S tier ships that are more oriented toward boss fights, but she really needs 3 carriers to be firmly in that tier. A-Gear and Guam have slipped as well, because I honestly can't find a situation where A-Gear offers anything more than Eldritch. Like yeah, she deals more damage obviously, but the inconsistent slow compared to Eldritch makes you lose total damage on average, so what's the point really? Still a great ship, but just use Eldritch. If you don't have Eldritch's retrofit item, expect it to return within the next month. This is your reminder to not miss out on the retrofit item. Guam finds herself in a similar situation as Laffy 2, where being a tank that can anti-air is not that special anymore, so she didn't make the cutoff for S tier, but the order of these ships have largely stayed the same. Next up are Fushun and Taiyuan. They bring light armor Maltation, but the reason they're ahead of St. Louis is because their damage is still solid against medium armor with the appropriate equipment, whereas St. Louis falls off a cliff against non-light. Next up is Bayard, who has some insane damage output for a random gold BR, somehow in the same series as Halford. I don't really understand it. Basically, if you're looking for a ship to round out your campaign Vanguard, you can't really go wrong with Bayard. She's not quite as strong as Hindenburg or Unzen, which is why she's in A tier, but she's tankier and has more anti-air for what it's worth. An easy fit for any campaign fleet that already covered all the core roles. Next up is Ibuki, who is a discount Unzen. Her damage and consistency is very close to Unzen against heavy armor, but she's quite a bit weaker against medium and light due to most of her damage being from torpedoes, while Unzen has very powerful main guns as well. Ibuki's preload is also stronger than Unzen's. Watarase's full damage potential depends on who your flagship is, but she's not exactly difficult to make work. Testing her head-to-head against Bayard, without giving her Oxytorps, which would skyrocket her damage even further, she was about tied with Bayard provided your flagship is IJN, and is able to fire just twice in a battle. These two were so strong that I couldn't even get Ryuho to launch and proc Watarase's full barrage twice before most battles ended, and I didn't want to keep track of the timer for every battle, so I left it at a small sample size. If you use Musashi as the flagship, for instance with a fast gun, she'll do even more damage, and if you give her Oxytorps as you should, she'll do even more, but at baseline, she's still not much weaker than Bayard in campaign. Next up is Aurora. She's fallen off a little because they've been adding a lot of kind of well-rounded and buffer vanguards, but when I think of the ships that are taking her place in the fleets where I would have used her before, it's mostly ships in the S and A tier, so she can stay. After the next round of Vanguard damage power creep, enough to make Hindenburg drop to A tier, Aurora will probably end up shooting up again. St. Louis is the last ship in A tier for her damage against light armor, which is on par with the DDGs, while being easier to keep alive, but she doesn't do anything against other armor types. I would put her in an A asterisk tier, but she would end up by herself, so I just stuck her in the end of A tier. Next up is the AA tier. They're all extremely capable at their job, which is anti-air. Howden Liu's damage and survivability is probably closer to the ships in A tier, while Provincian and Shimanto are closer to the B tiers, and Cheshire wouldn't be on the list at all if not for her anti-air, and being like the cutest thing ever after Janus and Lungwoo, and maybe a few others, but she's also very soft and cuddly, so she has that going for her. Also, Howden Liu is way too stacked. Like she's bare feet with foot jewelry and a supple body, and she's an elf and the womb tattoo. It's just way too much. I thought Breast's Live 2D skin was already insane, but this goes even further and it's just her base skin. What the hell are they going to make later down the line? Okay, now we move on to the B tier, which features a whole bunch of ships that used to be in the A tier. First up is Shimakaze, who has fallen off quite a bit. Her main problem is that she's just too damn fast. Increasing the Vanguard movement speed significantly means that the Vanguard is more likely to just zoom to one side of the screen, and then torpedoes end up going nowhere. That, and there are more better options against heavy than before, like Z52, Trafalgar, and Watarase. The place I find that she's the most useful these days is actually late game campaign, despite her lack of anti-air. Survivability is not much of an issue if you're using Zuiho and Eldridge. She does a lot of damage when there are multiple enemies, and all of her torpedoes land consistently. There are still not many ships that can match her output, especially because most of it ignores shields as well. Unfortunately, even in those situations, ships like Bayard and Watarase still offer similar damage performance with better anti-air and bulk, so I thought it would be appropriate to drop her into the B tier. Sirius has the same issue as Kazagumo, where her value scales with how many carriers you're using, so with the recent wave of powerful battleships, she's appropriately fallen into the B tier. Jinsu meta and Kawakaze meta are, for my money, the best meta Vanguard ships. Jinsu has a niche use case as a tank in solo boss fights that have heavy armor. Not really a tank, but she lasts relatively long, and then deals a respectable amount of damage before going down, and most importantly, severely increases your other Vanguards' torpedo damage as well, having great synergy with Kazagumo and Unzen. No longer in A tier though, because, well, there are just better options now. As for Kawakaze meta, she just does a lot of damage, but just not quite enough to be an A. Maybe I'm underestimating her damage though, because I've only tested her at level 120, but I don't think she's quite on Bayard's level damage-wise, and definitely not survivability-wise. Next are 3 really tanky ships that I don't even know where I would use them anymore, with the ships that are in the upper tiers. So into B they go. They just don't offer enough aside from survivability to compete with the better ships, and they're not even tankier than Eldritch, as you might have noticed if you've been doing Kawakaze meta. Anshan and Changchun are similar to Fushun and Taiyuan, but their skills are buff-oriented. It's kinda hard to slot more than one of them these days, so they're not as good as the younger sisters, who are more self-sufficient, but still very strong. Next up are Hatsuzuki and Felix. I went and tested these two head-to-head just to make sure they're about the same. They essentially dealt the exact same amount of damage with the equipment I'm showing on screen right now. Raw footage will be linked in the description. However, Hatsuzuki could gain 10% more firepower and reload with 2 more IJN ships in the fleet since I had 0, so I would say her damage is actually ever so slightly higher than Felix's, with better but completely irrelevant anti-air, less bulk but still relatively sturdy, and then a handy 5% fleet-wide damage reduction to cap it all off. Actually, I just remembered that Hatsuzuki is Oath and Felix isn't, so their damage is more or less identical. Felix seemed to do better in the battleship nodes, likely due to smaller sample size, or there are just more cruisers in these nodes compared to carrier ones, against which she has a specific damage buff. Very similar performance overall. Next up is Scylla. She deals a lot of damage in campaign, but not against heavy due to her barrage modifiers. It's kinda hard to test her damage in Chapter 15, where there are more heavy enemies, but also way too much anti-air damage. But on paper, she should fall off against heavy armor enemies, which is why she's not any higher. Her anti-air is not quite carrier level, like the ships in the AA tier, and the ones I mentioned previously, but also better than pretty much all the other ships that aren't AA carries. Next up is Kawakaze. She's still quite a bit stronger damage-wise than all these ships around her, but that's about all she's got. She's also weaker in pretty much all aspects than her meta version, minus her buff for IJN destroyers, but it's difficult to find room to sortie multiple of them these days. Campaign-wise, I would say that these 3 deal decent damage, and then Kawakaze is a noticeable step up from them, and then Kawakaze meta is another step up from Kawakaze, and then Bayard is a further step up from that. And then finally, Hindenburg and Unzen are at the highest level. Next, Neptune and Kronstadt are essentially tied for me as well. Their damage is roughly on par in campaign, and Neptune ends up having better survivability after many of her zombie heal procs, but in a single fight, I think Kronstadt is better, though I don't really see any reason to use her in a boss fight these days. I don't find Kronstadt's cross-fleet spread reduction all that useful anymore, with 2 Admiralty fire control radars, the USB auxiliary for Vanguards, and Near guns that are just more accurate. I don't really know if these 2 are stronger than Hatsuzuki and Felix, because I have them at just level 120, but I don't think the difference is large and destroyers have anti-submarine capability, so I put them ahead. Next up are Yatsen and Harbin. Yatsen should be with the other tanks, but she has to be sortied with another Dragon Emperor ship, which is typically going to be Harbin in campaign, where you would want to use her, so they end up next to each other. These 5 ships are really not much different from each other in functionality, being stat sticks with a bit of utility. Next is L'Audacieux. It's hard to do a head-to-head comparison with her, because she has so many buffs and also needs to be sortied with other French ships, but I found her to be an overall solid ship. Here's an end screen of her being used against Kawakaze meta. Aside from her personal damage, which is solid, we only have access to a single Mogador gun right now, which kimps her personal damage a little bit compared to Mogador. She also increases Mogador's damage and survivability by a considerable amount. It's no surprise that she goes under the radar as a French destroyer buffer, as there's only really Mogador and then a bunch of troll ships, but she's no slouch, I'll tell you that much. Finally, we have Fancy. She's not exactly B tier, more like B asterisk tier. She can equip an auxiliary that gives the fleet she's in an extra ammo, which makes full clearing 15-4 a breeze because the mob fleet does 6 fights and doesn't run out of ammo with her extra ammo, and that 1 out of ammo fight is probably more difficult than the first 5 fights combined. Particularly when you run into a 3-star battleship node out of ammo, which is out of your control on auto search. I probably have to go and compare 15-4 with and without her with some of the more recent ships to see if she's worth bringing for that extra ammo. I feel like she wouldn't be worth bringing over someone like Z52, but I mean compared to the other B tiers, yeah, I would probably bring her over Felix or Hatsuzuki for 15-4 auto search specifically, even though they're quite solid. As for the ships that have been entirely removed, Lala is gone because she's a collab ship, but she would be a solid B tier stat stick, with a little bit of utility on top. Jervis was once upon a time one of the only 2 ships that could tank and anti-sub at the same time, while also bringing a little bit of Vanguard healing, but there are many other alternatives now. Okay, in the to be determined tier, these 2 are both ships that are likely going to see the most use in specifically battleship fleets meant to tackle medium armor. I have prematurely placed Baltimore in A tier, but I want to properly test them out against a medium armor boss before drawing any conclusions. I think they have a better chance at B tier than A, but their use case is going to be pretty niche. Maybe I'm underestimating Doenskoi's damage output, and she's actually on Bayard's level, but I don't really see it. I also revamped the Q tier a bit to make it less bloated. I'm now only featuring my top 10 favorite ships of each hull class, which at 140% zoom on a 1080p monitor with the sidebar open, there are exactly 10 on each row, which is nice. Anyway, that's pretty much it for this major Vanguard tier list update. The carrier and battleship ones should be coming out shortly as well, so look forward to that. As always, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.